Some of the questions have been addressed to John, and some of the questions have been addressed to Joe, and some of the questions have been addressed generally. So I'll start with a question for John. John, you said the text, the way it was meant to be read for the people of that time. Do you agree that despite that, because God is outside time, he knows we would also find meaning in the text in different periods of historical time, like today, that does relate to our context too? Does that question work for you?
Yeah, I think I addressed this when I spoke, because it's certainly possible that God can have meanings beyond what he said to the Israelites. But my question is, I want the authoritative text of Scripture. I don't want just things that might happen to be true about how we think about science and the Bible and the world today. If God had meaning that he did not give to those authors, where do we get it? We might say, well, we can deduce and perceive truth. That's not authoritative text. I want to know what the authoritative claims of Scripture are. Now, those authoritative claims are what drive our understanding of this conversation between science and Scripture. There are plenty of compatible truths, and God may well have had us in mind and anticipated that we would see connections. Connections is not authority. And I think we have to make sure that we see that distinction. I've also been given permission to say briefly, basically this went a different direction than what we had planned. The idea was that I was to give a view of Genesis 1, and that Joe was to give another view of Genesis 1. It was not to be a debate. But as it turns out, Joe decided to spend an hour refuting me when I had no chance to do that to what he had to say. No, that's okay. I mean, I can live with that. I understand that people have objections to some of the things that I say. In fact, however, I can agree with many of the things that Joe said. I agree that the church fathers were not thinking functionally. What I did not say that the Enlightenment was the first time anybody thought materially. I said the Enlightenment was when we started saying material was all there was. Yes, Aristotle was thinking materially. He's not ancient. He's classical. He's not the ancient Near East. The Septuagint was not the ancient Near East. They were Hellenistic interpreters of Scripture, not inspired authors. The church fathers were already well past the Hellenistic period and already thinking materially. There's no question that all the interpreters we have, Qumran, intertestamental, are already thinking materially because they are already subject to Hellenistic thinking. That is not the ancient Near East. So I agree with all of the points that my friend brought out here. I agree with them entirely. I could bring you many more. I can also show you where they were thinking about functional, but they were certainly thinking materially as well. So I accept that, but that's not the ancient world. That's the classical world, that's the Hellenistic world, that's the Byzantine world, etc., etc. And we have to make those distinctions clearly. The only other thing I want to comment on, I mean, I could talk about it point by point, but that would do nothing at this stage. The only other thing I want to say is that when the Reformers talked about perspicuity of Scripture, the clarity of Scripture, they weren't talking about that it lacked complexity. Those guys wrote volume after volume of commentaries trying to understand Scripture, and they disagreed with one another. They meant that the basic truth of Scripture was clear to everyone. And again, I don't disagree at all. So a lot of what was said, seemingly in refutation of my point, are things that I absolutely agree with. And that's enough said on that.
Thanks, John. Okay. John, I've got to confess that most of these are questions addressed to John. You must have convinced everybody. But I have one for you, Joe. Joe, if the ancient people were mostly illiterate, could the scholars of the day have been recording what the common people may have been passing around orally?
Sure.
Good answer.
I agree.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll put that question to one side. We seem to have that one resolved. Here's one for you, John. John, what is the most profound question you've been asked about your theories for which you don't have an answer? Do I have permission to ask that question?
If I thought I didn't have answers to something, that could lead to the collapse of a theory. But obviously, there's some things I have really good answers, I think, and others that, I do my best to give whatever answer I can give. And actually, the one that Joe has raised is one that is often raised. So, he's hit right at the heart of it, and that's the question, why can't it be both? Both and instead of either or. I mean, he raised exactly the issue which people often deal with. My basic response to that is to say, well, it certainly could be both and, but I don't want to look at what it could be. I want to look at what it is as best as I can tell. And so I have to prove it's functional. Okay, and it sounds like I've convinced people that there's a strong functional element there. But likewise, people would have to prove that it's material. You can't just say, well, since I think that it is material, and since I think God did create things materially, well, it must be that kind of story too. No, it's not a must. You have to demonstrate that it's material. There's no question God did create materially. All these passages that were brought up in the Old Testament and the New Testament that show God did create materially, why, of course he did, and I agree with that. Remember, I'm not asking what God did, I'm asking what is this narrative about? And the fact that a later interpreter might think the narrative is about material does not prove it's about material. I don't want to deal with what interpreters think. I want to deal with what the text says. And so I'm not impressed when a lot of interpreters think it's material. If they're just assuming that, well, that doesn't help any. I want to see the evidence of it. So I want somebody to go through Genesis 1 and show me how that text is demonstrably material. And that's a difficult thing to do. So that's how I would respond to it. It could be both. Maybe it is both. But I just don't see the material aspect there if we swipe away our inclinations to think materially.
Good, thank you. Not sure about this question, but we'll give it a go. Actually, no, I think it's addressed to John because it's about archetypes. If Adam and Eve are archetypes of all humans, where does sin come from that affects all humans? That seems a question 1A. 1B, did the other people become sinful when Adam and Eve sinned?
Well, obviously, how sin spreads is a complex question no matter what model you follow. Whether it's a traditional model, an Augustinian model, whatever model you follow, that spread of sin is a difficult one. Okay, so every theory has to deal with that. Now, if Adam is an archetype and his sin is affecting everyone by nature of his doing it, well, how did that happen? Is it something that's passed on biologically, genetically? What model are we talking about? Augustine seemed to think generally in that term, although he didn't know anything about genetics, of course. But Irenaeus had other ideas. Irenaeus is a church father about the same time as Augustine, and he had other ideas of how sin was spread. And so all we can do is develop models. Irenaeus would have thought more in terms of accountability. That is, people became accountable when Adam, their representative, sinned. And through him they all sinned, they all became accountable, and therefore their actions became sin. Well, that's just one model. Again, at some point, all we can do is build theological models because the text doesn't tell us. It doesn't explain these things. And so all we can do is build theological models. I don't know if I covered all that one or not. Did I get both 1 and 2?
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah,
Okay.
You did well, thank you. We're coming back again to the functional and material again. John, what do you do with Genesis 2, where it says, early in the chapter, I think verse 5, the point that Joe was made, that there was no man to till the earth. I think that's a material, functional type question.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't say there was no man. It says there was no man to till the earth. Tilling the earth is a intentional farming agricultural activity. Early people were not tilling the earth. And so again, what's the text saying? It's not saying there were no people. It says there were no people doing a certain kind of activity. And therefore, there was no agricultural growth of the sort that is worked on by people.
Thank you. I'm having trouble finding a Joe question here, Joe.
I'm saving my voice.
Another one for John. Is Isaiah 65:17 and Revelation 21:1 speak of a new heaven and a new earth. Is this also functional?
Well, yes, it is functional. Is it only functional? Is God creating the new heavens and the new earth even now? I don't know. Jesus said he was going to prepare a place for us. Is that new heavens and new earth? It's hard to tell. I certainly agree with Joe that that this is the whole Bible issue. That just as Genesis 1 talks about the initial steps of bringing order, new creation are the final steps in bringing order. And therefore, full order is going to be achieved in new creation. So that new creation is something that is going to be ordered. There will be no sea. Have you noticed that in Revelation 21? There will be no sea, because sea is connected to non-order. There will be no darkness. That's connected to non-order, still talking in these kinds of terms. There will be no temple, for God himself will dwell among us. There will be no disorder, no pain or suffering. And so in that sense, new creation is bringing about a whole new world. Now, it wouldn't matter to me if it was material as well as functional, because remember, God did create the material world as well. And therefore, if he's going to create a new world, he's going to do so materially as well, if it's a material world, and I assume that it is. So again, it's not a question of, is this world material now? Did God create it material? Yes, he did. But what story is Genesis 1 telling is the question I asked. God created this material world. The Bible talks about God creating this material world. Okay? And the new creation, I assume, will be material as well as functional. And again, Revelation gets to tell its own story. It's not necessarily telling the same story as Genesis 1.
Good, thank you. I've been weeding is not really the right word. Culling is probably not a good word either. Some questions have been answered as other questions have been answered, so you would have seen me putting a few over here. There's a question about Genesis 3, but I don't think we'll stray into Genesis 3 just now. Here's question A, B, and C here. They do relate, so I'll answer all three together. And it does say John Walton at the top of the page. I'm sorry. A, do you believe there was a literal Garden of Eden? B, if so, was there more than one man and woman there? C, and if so, does the story of the fall describe the actions of an individual or humanity in general?
A, that's fine with me if there was. If there wasn't, that's okay with me too. It is an ancient Near Eastern concept that gardens are built next to sacred space for God to meet with his people. So if it's that concept, that's fine. If it's literal, that's fine. Whichever the Bible means, I agree with. Was there only one man and woman there? Yes. The slide I skipped, one of them, was about the priestly role. Adam and Eve were put in the garden to serve and to keep. Those are priestly roles. Those words are used for priestly behavior throughout the Pentateuch. And that talks about their role in sacred space. As archetypes, they were representatives of all because all were acting in them. But as priests, they're representatives in a different way. So they were in the garden, that probably literal garden. They were in the garden representing as priests the other people who were not. So in that sense, they were the only ones playing that role. It's not until later on that all Israel is a royal priesthood, and then finally all believers are priests. But that's progress along the way. And the third part of that question was...
So Does the story of the fall describe the actions of an individual or humanity in general?
Yes, an individual. I think there was a fall that was a point in time that was carried out by historical Adam and Eve. And therefore sin entered the world at that point. Okay? Although perhaps also the accountability that came about because of that act is part of it. Remember that the fall is not just eating a piece of fruit. The fall is not just disobedience. The fall is wanting to be like God. That's what the temptation was, and that's what they pursued. To pursue that desire to be like God, they disobeyed and they ate fruit. Okay, but the sin is wanting to be like God. And that sin was accomplished by them, and all others were engulfed in that because that sin spread to all through the actions of one.
I want to sneak Joe in. Do you have any comment on that same question about Garden of Eden? Garden of Eden and one man and one woman in it and sin affecting all? Anything you'd like to add?
As far as the Garden of Eden, I obviously don't have the ancient world knowledge as far as gardens and sacred space regarding outside of temples and so forth. However, my understanding regarding Adam and Eve and sin, and that being by an historical person and affecting all historical people, I think that is another example where I'm going to be driven not to further interpreters, but through the rest of Scripture. And I would be led to the New Testament and how does particularly Paul understand sin and the origination of sin, how it came through one man. And it would seem to me that it's not just simply an archetype that Paul is describing. He's describing an actual historical person who was the first human being for which all other human beings descended, and that sin came into the world through that man's disobedience. Paul says it's not just simply a matter of wanting to be like God, but it was disobedience. Through man's disobedience came sin. So I do think there's a little bit more to it that's more particularly clarified by Paul in the New Testament that theologically we have to wrestle with, that's bigger than just an archetype representation of wanting to be like God that representatively affected all people. But I do think there is actually a seminal effect of the fact that through one man's disobedience, just like one man's obedience, this is the Romans 5 issue, it's disobedience and obedience that is brought into comparison in that chapter. And so man disobeyed, another man obeyed, and through his obedience we receive righteousness.
But not biologically or genetically passed down from Christ.
That's right.
Right.
You want to add any more? No. Okay. Yeah. Here's a hermeneutics question. This is for you again, John. I'm sorry. Well, I'm not sure. I'm happy for you. I'm sure you'll be happy to answer hermeneutics questions. There's a protasis and an apodosis here. I'm not sure that the protasis applies, but we'll see how. I think the apodosis does. If the real meaning of the text is so obscure as to be different from what it communicates to us in the 21st century, how can we understand anything it says?
We can't, no, okay. No, of course, what is obscure? The basic gospel is not obscure, the nature of God is not obscure, the work of Christ is not obscure. But is exegesis obscure? Is interpretation? Sometimes. Hebrew is a difficult language. Greek is a difficult language. There are things we don't know anymore. There are words in the Hebrew text that we don't know what they mean. But you can't leave a blank in the Bible. People get mad about that. So, yes, there are obscurities. Can we be sure of anything? Yes, we can be sure of what the Bible is clear about. We can do our best when the Bible is not clear. And we can admit our ignorance when the Bible is impenetrable, which at points it is. And that's okay. Again, remember, God was not communicating to us. And in the process, some understanding has been lost. Would God let that happen? Sure. There's no reason why not. we've got the basics, we've got what we need, and we can keep working to recover as much as we can. But it takes a lot of study, and there are things that we all have trouble understanding. But the fact is, God gave Scripture that is limitless in the depth to which it goes. We should always expect that there's more depth than we know, more understanding to be gained than we will ever fathom, and that God has revealed himself in that way, because that reflects his nature itself. But there's enough for us to know our responsibility, to know God, to be in relationship with him. That's sufficient.